who is behind Weaving Reeds?
Weaving Reeds is actually a whole team of people. But the three people that are really behind it, the founders, so to say, thereof, are myself and two close friends of mine. And we're just regular people, man. Just three moms trying to navigate the shark-infested waters of parenting. No, but seriously, shark-infested waters of parenting. Each of us has different things that we add to the group. So I'll start with myself. My name is Palesan Bevana. I am a mother of one who has officially entered the toddler stage. She's 2, and she's discovered the question why. I tend to be the more talkative one in the group, although all of us talk a lot. Don't let them fool you, but all of us talk a lot. But I'm the more talkative one. I've been speaking since I was 9 months old, so I guess it gives me a lot of practice. I tend to be the one that is slightly more, I want to say, impulsive. And I guess I'm more of the big picture kind of thing. It helps with the impulsivity. Then there's Bongani Kladi, and she's a mother of 2 boys. Bongi tends to be the more sensitive one, I'd like to say. Sensitive, not fragile. Sensitive, she's very empathetic. And I really appreciate that about her, actually. She also tends to be very detail-oriented, which helps because me, 0. And she's also very research-oriented. Then there's Butu Makaguli. She's a mother of 2 girls. So we've balanced the boy-girl ratio. And she also tends to be the anchor. She whenever Bongi and I run too far out, she kind of reels us back in. Very, I want to say, neat in how she sees things, well put together, in a sense. And yeah, that's basically who is behind Weaving Reeds.
How did you guys meet?
Oh, how we met. Man, we've been friends for more than 10 years now. But I think I met Bongi first. Once again, you'll see the impulsivity through it all, but was at church, and that weekend, I just got into Cape Town. So there was a concert that was happening, and somebody that I had also really just met, but who happened also to then become a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, introduced me to Bongi and her husband. And because this concert was happening, she was speaking and trying to get us to the concert. And Bongi's husband offered to get us there because actually what was happening was Bongi was also at the concert but helping out in a ministry that she had started called Health Nuggets. So I met her husband and then met her subsequently after that. And Bongi's she's a people's person. So shortly afterwards, she invited me for lunch at her place. And I remember thinking, I hope this lady can cook. But she could actually. And lunch at Bongi's place turns into lunch, then supper, then sleep over, then wake up. So that's actually how we then became friends. And really, I remember feeling like this was a really good Sabbath lunch conversation that I'd want to repeat over and over again. And thankfully, she didn't get bored of my presence and kept inviting me for Sabbath lunch. And that's how I met Bongi. A few weeks-ish later, I kept getting asked being asked by people, about my brother. Now, I did have a brother in Cape Town. My older brother was there, but my brother and I don't really look alike. But everyone kept telling me how much I look like my brother, and I didn't understand who they were speaking about. That brother happened to be Butu's husband. And when we met, he was also like, oh, so you're the little sister that everyone's been telling me about. I then subsequently met her a few weeks later when a friend asked us to actually work together in teaching her ambassador class. And turns out I had actually seen her many years before, but we never really spoke because Butu was pretending to be quiet at that time. And then we started chatting and hit it off. She also invites people for lunch at her place. And as a student, I feel like this was really luring me into the friendship. But yeah, that's then how we became friends, and it's honestly been a good dynamic since. Bongi and Butu then subsequently also became neighbors, and so they also then got closer from there. And that's how the friendship kind of grew.
Why did you start a podcast about Christian parenting?
Yeah, this is a bit of a odd question because it requires me to be personal. But I think not all of us have examples of what a good home looks like. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself, I guess. I was raised in a interesting household. In 90s movies, there's always that troubled household where there's substance use, abuse, a praying mother in the background, and that whole dynamic. That was my family. My family was far from perfect, probably less perfect than the average one. But that was the dynamic that I saw. And that was the example of family that I had. My parents then got divorced when I was 6. And I never really had, there were few and far between, but a real example of what a Christian, especially what an Adventist Black family looks like. And it didn't really bother me so much until later on in life. Now, I never wanted to get married, never saw myself having a family. That was never in my cards. I wanted to be the missionary sister for life, just going by myself. But the Lord slowed me down, actually, and kind of hooked me into getting married. So when I did get married, we didn't actually want to initially have kids. And I still struggled with this idea of what an Adventist home looks like, what a Christian Black Adventist home looks like. Thankfully, by then, I had some examples of what good Adventist homes look like. Bogi and Butta's homes were such families that I actually could draw inspiration from. But then I found out I was pregnant. And that wrecked me because I realized I had to create an environment where this child would not be starting on a back foot like I was. And I realized also I couldn't envision how to parent in a unit in a good Christian Adventist way. And I had, gotten into this zone where I was now starting to research and try to find, what Christian parenting could look like and what Adventist parenting could look like. And I was listening to a presentation by this lady, and it was really, honestly, a good presentation on parenting. But the issue was that she was coming from a context that I really couldn't mess with. It was not a context that was familiar to me. So some of the values that she didn't really emphasize were, for me, what I felt was lacking. If I was going to be raising a Black child in South Africa, I needed to teach her certain values. And now we have a group where we send things around, and I had sent it through to Butubongi and another friend of ours, Lynn. And when we all watched it, the first person that I actually called was Bongi. And Bongi actually said, look, it's great. However, there's this element that she also surprisingly was then struggling with. This idea that there is a framework of Africa, South Africa, of Blackness that was missing. And that's where I jokingly said, let's start a podcast. And then she was like, ha, ha, ha. And then I realized, no, seriously, let's actually start a podcast. This is where the impulsivity comes in. And she then went on to, think about it some more. And we're like, yeah, actually, let's start a podcast, because as much as there are some Black Christian parenting or lifestyle podcasts and marriage podcasts that you can find, there are very few that are such that are also Adventist. And there are some things that you can't carry from just a mere Christian context. Things like the Sabbath, or values that you can't really bring in because that's not a core tenet of their beliefs. And for us, that's also what I need to think of. I need to think of how to create that. I said, we all struggle with this idea of having examples, and maybe we can then put together collaboratively an example of what Christian parenting could look like, not necessarily from our own examples, but from conversations that are had, from resources that we can gather. So it's more than just a podcast, by the way. We Reads is more than just a podcast, but the podcast is one of the things where we can bounce ideas off about having a conversation about certain things within the Black Adventist context about Christian parenting. Basically, that's the story behind it.
What does Weaving Reeds mean?
When I was going through my phase of trying to find this idea of Christian parenting. I was looking for examples, right, of what an Adventist or what a Christian parent would look like, what a biblical parent would look like. So I turned to the Bible, and I realized there are very few people that actually got parenting right. But the one who stood out for me, she got 100% in terms of Christian parenting, in terms of the production that she, or the produce, the kids that she brought out of her parenting. And that's Jochebed. So that's Moses' mother. 3 kids. This lady raised 3 kids that were prophets and leaders, also musicians. That was really important for me because musicians. But that were leaders and prophets within the church and leaders of God's people at the time. And that struck me. And I started going deeper into the life of Jochebed, right? And for me, what struck me was the whole context under which Jochebed was parenting. If you look at the story, it's actually, I kind of divided it into the context and the content, her parenting story. The context is this. Jochebed is Levi's child, right? She is the last born, and she has a family. I mean, we all know of Levi's anger issues, and her family is far from perfect. And this is the context under which she's parenting, or the context that she finds herself in personally. But more than that, from the book of Exodus chapter 1, you see that there's this thing that's happening, a target on the male children. So first, it was the idea that, if any midwives, the Hebrew midwives, go and help a woman that is delivering a child, and a male child is specifically, she should basically kill the child off. Now, the midwives, thankfully, were God-fearing people, and they decided they're not going to do that, and they obeyed God, and they evaded that. And then Pharaoh then gives another decree to say that all males that are 2 years and under should be killed. And the context of this is that there was a time prophecy that was coming to an end, basically very soon. When when the Lord had spoken to Abraham, the Lord had told him that the children of Israel, his children, they weren't children of Israel then, but his children would be in captivity, or they would be in Egypt for 400 years. And this 400 years was now coming to an end. And there was a target that Satan was targeting against the children that would be brought up in this time, the time before the expiration of this prophecy. And so Jochebed is parenting within the context, one, of her frail human family. Each human family is bad, and hers was, not bad, but each human family is far from perfect, and hers was one like that. And she's parenting from that context. And then secondly, she's parenting under this idea of a time prophecy that is about to expire, and more so, a specific attack against the children. And within the greater context, she's parenting in the context of the great controversy, this battle between good and evil. And as this battle is now intensifying because God is about to lead his children out, there's a specific attack on her children, right? So when she gives birth to her last born, which is Moses, there is this decree that is hanging over her head about every male child under the age of 2 needing to be killed. And she doesn't do this. She hides the child for a while, but eventually he gets too big to hide. He must start crawling at some point. And she tries to think of how she can do this. And I picture in my mind's eye Jochebed's anxiety as she's thinking of a way out, as she's seeing her 3 children interact, and she's wondering how is she going to work around this. Her panic as she hears somebody's walking past, to try to hide this little boy. And the book of Hebrews tells us that she saw in him a goodly child. She knew the Lord had impressed within her heart. I mean, of course, there's the parental instinct, but the Lord had laid a burden on her heart specifically about this young boy. And I imagine her, praying and earnestly asking the Lord for a way out. And the Lord then reveals to her somehow that she should put this child on the river. Now, that already is a hectic idea, right? And I imagine her, weaving the basket that she's putting Moses in with angst, with prayer, with this foreboding of the future, what would happen to this young boy how could she make sure that he was safe? And more so, how could she make sure that her 2 other children were safe? And eventually, the book of Exodus 2 tells us that she makes this basket and puts in it pitch and covers it and puts him inside. And as she pushes it away, I can imagine the fear, firstly of drowning, but also of what would happen next. And she stations her oldest child, Miriam, afar off and says, look to see what will happen to the basket. Now, what already strikes me here is that Miriam is obedient. She's a child herself, but she's obedient, and she's already got this rehearsed speech of what should happen, and she's waiting to see what would happen to her little brother. And Jochebed, Mama J, will refer to her as that for the rest of the podcast because her name is difficult to say. And Mama J is, anxiously thinking what would happen to this child. And eventually it says that as the basket lands within the bulrushes, Pharaoh's daughter's maidens hear a cry afar off, and they gather close to see what happens. And as they open the basket, they see this child, and Pharaoh's daughter is touched by the idea of a mother trying to basically put her child in safety, keep her child safe. And Miriam now comes in her obedient, well-rehearsed speech and says, if you want, we can get a Hebrew maiden to nurse the child for you. Now, what I'm not sure of is, did Pharaoh's daughter think this probably is the child's mother? And with sympathy, did she just say yes and, take the child away to safety? We'll never know until heaven. But she eventually agrees. And when Mama J is given back her son, I believe there is specific anxieties more so about this child, because she must parent him, yes, within the context of all of these things, but there are specific challenges that he would face as now Pharaoh's stepson, or Pharaoh's daughter's stepson, Pharaoh's step-grandson. She must make sure that he was ready to face those. She is anxious to make sure that this young boy knows the Lord. She wants to ensure that he desperately, for himself, knows who God is. She wants to teach him. At the time, there were no 10 commandments to teach him, but there was the law of God that was known by his people. And she wants to teach him this law, to embed it in his heart, to make sure that he understands the horrors of idolatry, that he will face idolatry, not just idolatry, but the Egyptian religion was one that was steeped in mysticism and, all of these ideas. And he had to be able to stand against those things. So as she's raising him, some say she only had around 12 years, to make sure that Moses would stand faithful for the rest of his life, to stand faithful in the palaces of Pharaoh against many temptations that are against him. There are so many things that could lure his heart away from God. There were distractions that he had to face, and she tries to make sure with every lesson that he knows God for himself. He knows how to hear God's voice for himself, that he knows God's law, God's requirements, this idea of God as the leader and the ruler of all, that he also is able to stand against the distractions of his time, that he's able to stand against the mysticism that he is faced with basically in Pharaoh's palace. And this story struck me specifically because we are living in a time close to the end of Earth's history. We're also at the end of time prophecy, so to say. And every time that we're nearing a special moment in God's work, there's a specific attack on children. We see it with Moses. We see it when Jesus was born. Satan, in this great controversy context we find ourselves in, specifically targets the children of a generation that has a lot to accomplish. And because of that, we need to kind of change the way we're parenting. We can't be parenting like how we were parented. We need to make sure that our children, like Mama J was making sure with Moses, know to hear God's voice for themselves, that they see God as the all in all. We need to make sure that they are able to stand in the context that they will find themselves in. Our context is also one that is steeped in mysticism and, new ageism and spiritualism and all of these things that our children will face. And we need to be training them up to face we need to be training the generation that will ultimately bring the work to a close and that will usher in the second coming of Christ. A generation that Revelation chapter 14 tells us has the faith of Jesus. The faith of Jesus, and also that they keep the commandments of God. So we, like Mama J, find ourselves in this context. Great controversy. We find ourselves in the context of our own parented lives. We too are children that have issues. We have generational thoughts and ideas that we have to face and reckon with. We find ourselves parenting in that context. But we have to teach them, like I said, there's context and there's content. We need to teach them to know, to hear God's voice for themselves. We need to teach them to obey God's commands. We need to teach them to stand against spiritualism and the things that they are facing. We need to help them to basically overcome the distractions. And I mean, our time has a specific distraction called the television and phone and all of those things, the media that our children find themselves actually engrossed by. We need to help our children navigate these waters. So we, like Mama J, are trying in a short space of time to raise a generation. And we must basically do like what Mama J did, which is weaving the basket of faith, of prayer, of hope, of lessons. And that's what I believe parenting is. It's merely just bringing together the reeds that we have of all of these things, the faith, the prayer, the knowledge, the information that we can gather, and basically moving our children to safety, putting them in a basket, weaving a basket of safety for them to shelter them against the mess of life. And at some point, we're not sure when, but we will also be at this point in our parenting journey where we have to, with faith, put our children on the river and hope, pray, beg that they don't sink, but also beg that the Lord brings them to safety and to the mission that He has for them. Jochebed is such a successful parent, but by the time we hear Moses hearing God's voice for himself in Exodus chapter 4 in the burning bush, there's a story behind that. There's a child who is on his mother's lap, being taught diligently the stories of faith. There is a mother anxiously weaving together a reed basket to make sure that this boy would know God. And that is the thing, the desire that we have for this podcast. It is one of the reeds that we want to put in your hands, that you would weave together this basket of safety for your children, so that ultimately our children can be that generation, can be those that would be able to stand faithful, that when Christ comes, we and our children together would find ourselves in the kingdom. So our desire for this podcast and for this ministry is that we would give you the reeds, and we would weave together the reeds of information and faith and hope, and bring them together to raise this generation, this final generation that I believe that as we come closer to the second coming of Christ and Satan has a special attack against this generation of children, God would give us special tools, special reeds to weave together. So join us in this journey of faith, in this journey of hope, in this journey of information and gathering information, in this journey of helping each other through our mistakes and hopefully lack of mistakes. And grab your Bibles with us and let's get weaving.
God had heard the mother's prayers. Her faith had been rewarded. It was with deep gratitude that she entered upon her now safe and happy task.